From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
On behalf of the Library of Congress, welcome to the 2012 National Book Festival. My name is Steve Mufson. I'm the energy correspondent for the Washington Post, and I'm here to introduce Dan Yergin, who I first met when I was an intern at the Wall Street Journal in 1979. And I've known him and talked to him on and off ever since. And now more than ever that I'm covering energy yet again, this time for the Washington Post. And so also on behalf of the Washington Post, welcome. Dan has been a leading voice on energy issues since I met him, since right around that time when he wrote about energy future, and then he wrote about energy security, and then of course he wrote his wonderful prize-winning book called The Prize about the history of the oil industry. And now with the Quest, he's brought us right up to date on all sorts of new developments, and there are a tremendous number of new developments in the energy field, from shale gas to electric cars, and I'm sure he'll tell us all about that. And without further ado, I bring you Dan Yergin.
Good morning, everybody, and we'll remind you again, I guess, about the camera risers. I didn't realize that was an issue. Thank you, Steve, for introducing me. Good morning or good afternoon to you all. It's great to see you here at this extraordinary book festival, which is, the spirit of it is wonderful, and glad to see all you book lovers here this morning. I'm very pleased to be introduced by Steve. Just this morning in the Washington Post, he has a more than a full-page article about the very terminus of the Keystone XL pipeline, a great story about the refining side. So recommend it all to you this morning. Is the sound okay, everybody? Great. On the early morning hours of August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi tanks rolled into Kuwait City and in an effort to annex Kuwait and make it the 13th province of Iraq. Not long after that, really within hours, a meeting was convened at the White House by President George H.W. Bush, and there was much discussion about what to do about it. And some said we should prepare for what he was called a Kuwaitless world and just adjust to it in some way. And President Bush raised his hand and said, not so fast, and of course unfolded then the coalition, the Gulf War in 1991, which seemed to presage a new era of stability in world oil. Well, just a few days after that invasion, I was finishing my page proofs actually for the prize, and I had to write the conclusion. And I wrote that the modern and mesmerizing alchemy of oil would continue to work its effects on the world, and that ours would continue to be an age of oil. Well, that was 2 decades ago, and as Steve said, a lot has happened since then. And I could just itemize some of them that are significant. There's no longer a Soviet Union. Young people in the audience will probably not even remember the Soviet Union or only have a dim memory of it. There's no Cold War. When I finished the prize, China wasn't a force in world energy. All it was a minor exporter of oil. Climate change was not a political issue at all. No one had heard of shale gas. If it had any name at all, it was known as uneconomic gas. Oil as late as 2004 was $20 a barrel, and it was going to remain $20 a barrel forever, and then it began its ascent. And even more recently, if we were meeting here not in September of 2012, but on March 10th, 2011, we might well have been talking about the nuclear renaissance. The next day came the terrible accident at Fukushima and the end of the nuclear renaissance and what we have today, what might be called a nuclear patchwork. And of course, the Middle East was going to be the same forever, but it has been upended by what was called the Arab Spring, but really no longer, because it's going to be at least a decade, whatever it unfolds. But it upended the strategic balance that had dominated the Middle East really for 3 decades in very important ways, and as we know today, with continuing uncertainty. So a lot had happened, which was one reason to dive into the quest. The other thing is that I wanted to widen the focus and not just write about oil, but I wanted to cover the whole spectrum from conventional energy, oil, natural gas, electric power, climate change, the new energies, solar, renewables, the electric car, and kind of see them all in perspective and see if I can put them all together. And so all of that became the basis or the canvas with which I started writing The Quest. I have to say it was a personal quest. It took 5 years. I'm notoriously bad planner when it comes to books because I signed a contract saying I would do it in 2 years, and come year 3 or so they start knocking the door and ask where it is. The other thing, it's very challenging to write about a subject this broad, and the way that I've found that I can best tell stories like this is to find what I call the emblematic personalities, who are the people who in one way or the other embody the story or help me carry them. And some of the characters in this book would be completely unknown to you all, and some would be very well known. I thought I'd just talk about a few of them because they help carry the story. There was a professor at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, named Ari Hagen-Smith, and probably no one in the audience has heard of him because he was there a long, long time ago. He won every chemical prize except the Nobel Prize. People said he should have gotten the Nobel Prize as well. He was obsessed with plants. So he was the one who figured out where the taste came from in onions, in wine, in garlic. He was the one who actually discovered the active ingredients in marijuana, to which there's a legend that there's a statue somewhere in California that's been raised up in his honor. But what he was really obsessed with was the pineapple, and he wanted to understand the flavor of pineapple. Where does that come from? And he was working in his lab one day in 1948 on that very subject, and he decided he wanted to go out for some of that beautiful California air, sort of like this, and he went out, and instead he found himself in what he called a stinking cloud of smog. Interestingly, at that time, no one knew where smog came from. They thought it was from backyard incinerators. He figured out that it came from the incomplete combustion of gasoline in an automobile engine. And that started the whole process of reform. A well-known environmentalist named Ronald Reagan established the California Air Resources Board, appointed him as the first head of it. And the California Air Resources Board is the one who started the mandates that really became the basis of the electric car today, that's unfolding today. And so, you know, as part of what I try to do in this book is say, where do things come from? And in a way, the electric car partly comes back from Ari Hagen-Smith, their experience in 1948. A second character who's very interesting in the book, well, let me put it this way. As you know, a lot of young people have trouble getting jobs today, getting out of school. And this particular young man that I write about had a lot of trouble. He had a very good science degree, but he couldn't get a job. He started offering tutoring, couldn't get any customers, started offering free samples of tutoring, sort of Kaplan-like today, still couldn't get any jobs. His father finally wrote a letter to one of his professors and said, would you please help my son? He grows more and more unhappy day by day, and he believes that his career has been permanently derailed. That was Albert Einstein. Fortunately, he did get a job in the patent office in Bern, in Switzerland. He had a very slow summer, so he wrote 5 papers that changed the course of the world. The one that got the Nobel Prize was the one about photoelectricity. And so that's when he wrote the theory of it and explained it. It took half a century before the first application of solar cells happened, which was in the course of in the aftermath of Sputnik, that in order to power the satellite and the communications, they used photovoltaic cells. So that was 1958. Here we are in 2012, talking about Cylindra, talking about the competitiveness of solar cells. So what is that? That's 107 years. One of the arguments I make in the book is that lead times are very long in terms of energy, and I'd say 107 years is a long time. I'll mention two other characters. One of the questions I want to know is kind of where did the modern wind industry come from? Obviously, windmills went back at least 1,000 years to ancient Persia. And so I started to try and find out, how did the wind industry get going? And I found a guy named Jim Delson. And Jim spent New Year's Eve, 1981, not having a party, not having a good time. He spent it on a wind turbine in the Tehachapi Pass in California in a blizzard, trying to get his wind turbine up by midnight. Some of you will know why he wanted to get it up by midnight, because at midnight the tax credits ran out. So this was a tremendous incentive. He did it, got it up, got his tax credits, and then the wind turbine fell apart. So he said there has to be a better way to do this. So he went off to Europe and thought he'd discover the secret in Holland, but instead he ended up in Denmark and found that the sturdy Danish agricultural machinery industry was really good at building wind turbines. So he started importing them into the United States. It turned out that California was the birthplace of the modern wind industry. At one point, 90% of the turbines were from Denmark. So when you say, where did the modern wind industry come from? I would say it's the result of the marriage between the sturdy Danish agricultural machinery industry and California tax credits. That's why we have a wind industry today. I'll mention one other. This is the only book you will ever read on the subject of energy, ever, that talks about the worst moment in Ronald Reagan's career as an actor. And for those who want to know, it was when he couldn't get work after he was president of the Screen Actors Guild. He ended up in doing stand-up comedy, fronting for a singing group called the Continentals in the Last Frontier Hotel in Las Vegas. Did a good job, did it for 2 weeks, hated it, thought his career was over. He comes back to Los Angeles, phone rings, and on the phone is his agent, Ronnie. And what he had to tell him is he had this new gig for him in which he would be the spokesman, as some in this audience will remember, for General Electric. It was quite a, for the time, good contract. In today's dollars, it would be about $1 million a year. It also said he didn't have to fly because he hated flying. So he started doing that. And the reason I write about it is because at that time, electricity demand in the United States was growing at approximately 10 or 11% a year, very much like what you have now happening in China or India. That was very significant for our country, but it was a US phenomenon. But this kind of growth we're seeing in electricity around the world today in those other countries really has very direct impacts everywhere in the world, including the United States. So those are some of the personalities, some of the way I tell the story. But there are three big questions that really frame the story. First is the perpetual question in energy about scarcity versus abundance. In other words, are we going to run out of energy? And this is, has been as old as we've had commercial energy. In 1881, famous British scientist said the world's coal reserves were about to run out. So little was left. This is 1881, and he actually said at that point the only answer was wind power. But in terms of running out of oil, what I say in the book is we've run out of oil actually 5 times. And the latest time, last few years, but the first time was in the 1880s, and new territories open up. But we do have a very different kind of challenge today, and that's the challenge of growth. We have a world economy today that might be $70 trillion. 2 decades, it might be double that. Where's the energy going to come from? How's it going to be provided? And I think that's a really a very big question, one I struggle with. The second is about energy security, the second big question. And this is, in a sense, a perennial question. It really goes back, in one sense, if you read the prize, to World War II. But in modern times, really, the first Mideast crisis, 1956, Suez, and periodically, particularly crises in the Mideast, set off the questions of energy security. And we face those questions today. But there's a new dimension to it, and the new dimension of security is a question of cybersecurity. And just about 3 weeks ago now, one of the largest oil companies in the world, based in the Middle East, public knowledge was it had a major cyber attack on it. It affected the commercial operations. It didn't affect, as I understand, the production side of it. But we have entered what the former CEO of Sony, after their website was attacked, $170 million it cost them. It's called the bad new world of cyber vulnerability, and I think it's really on the agenda about our critical infrastructures, including the energy system. The third big question that really frames the book is the question of energy and the environment. And every stage of the production, the consumption, transportation of energy involves big environmental questions. And I talk about them. The big one today is, of course, climate. And I wanted to ask again, how did climate become such a big question? And so I thought I'd write one chapter on it. I ended up writing 6 chapters. I learned so much doing it. It's a totally fascinating story. And to realize that the climate considerations really began in the 1770s when a Swiss scientist asked the question, how come we don't freeze at night and boil during the day? And he came up with the notion that there was something called the atmosphere. And then in the 19th century, some other scientists realized that once before our present age, there had been an ice age, and these 19th century scientists were very afraid that the ice age would come back and obliterate civilization. And that's when climate science started. But for the first century, it was primarily about another ice age. It was only in the 1950s, the late 1950s, that it started to turn around and focus on carbon and the question of warming. Now, those are the big themes and questions, but I'll just say how they kind of interact with some of the things that are on the agenda today. Number one, of course, energy is always involved with geopolitics. That underlying problem in the Middle East of the youth bulge, this tremendous population of young people who don't have jobs and opportunities, is still there. It's what did much to start the turmoil in North Africa. Some countries have the wealth to try and deal with it, but that's going to continue to be there. Clearly, the uncertainties brought home as we speak about what happens with the new regimes in the Middle East, the new political order. But the big question right now that overhangs everything is Iran. And it was last November that the United Nations Nuclear Agency said that Iran seems to be embarked on nuclear weapons course. We have sanctions in place on Iran to try and lead to negotiations. The sanctions have been surprisingly effective, but no negotiations, and maybe there won't be any until after the presidential election. But I think this overhangs the whole system. There are a lot of other geopolitical questions tied with energy, which we can talk about in the question period, such as the South China Sea, where tension is rising. But the second big question is growth. And the question of growth in China, I just back from a couple of weeks there, and again, it just brings home what this growth in the emerging markets means for world energy. China now uses more energy than the United States. 20 million people a year moving from countryside to cities means they need housing, they need jobs, they need transportation. All of that has to do with energy. And a statistic that really brings it home to me how the world is changing is automobiles. We all think of the United States as the home of the automobile, as the main, this is the country of that. So if we look at 2000, 17 million new cars were sold in the United States, less than 2 million in China. Go forward 10 years, 17 million new cars in China and 12 million in the United States. And that really tells you the road we're on and meeting energy demand and this demand growth. And I mentioned maybe a doubling of world GDP in the next 20 years, and that might mean, at least I argue in the book, something like a 35% increase in world energy, maybe our energy going down, other countries' energies going up. A big question about how that energy will be supplied. Well, let me come back then to technology. Wind and solar get a lot of attention. Let me just make 2 observations about them. They're almost inseparable, like they're one noun. But wind is much, much bigger than solar. Wind is now about 4% of our electricity. Solar is less than 0.1% of our electricity, but has a potential to grow. Both of those are suggested are technologies that came out of the 1970s and 1980s. The biggest energy innovation of this century is shale gas in terms of its scale and the rapidity and its impact on the energy marketplace. Shale gas has gone from being about 2% of our natural gas production to 40%. There's controversy about it, and I can talk a little bit about the controversy. I was on the commission that President Obama had set up to look at the environmental aspects. But what's really striking about it is the economic impact in terms of job creation, economic activity. Instead of spending $100 billion a year as a country importing liquefied natural gas, we're now producing ourselves, and it's become an important source of growth, particularly during this downturn. It's also tied into the production of oil, as actually Steve Mufson has written quite eloquently in the Washington Post about, because it has turned North Dakota into the second largest oil-producing state in the country. And the number that strikes me is that our oil production as a country is up 1.8 million barrels a day. Now, most of you don't say, well, what does that mean? That's equivalent to 80% of the amount of oil Iran was exporting before the sanctions went into place. So in other words, it has really global impact. And if you take what's happening in oil in the United States, you take what's happening in Canada in terms of oil sands, take what's probably going to happen in Brazil in their offshore oil, what may happen in other countries, you still start to see that for the first time, if not energy independence, which every president since Richard Nixon has called for, certainly the US and North America has the capacity to be much less dependent. And it's just beginning a discussion about what does that mean in terms of strategy, in terms of geopolitics, not now, but 5 or 10 years from now. I'll say on technology, the one other thing I wanted to mention, of course, is the electric car. There's two fabulous pictures in the book. One is of a woman charging an electric car in 1910, and the other is the CEO of Nissan charging a car in 2010. And if you look at the pictures, they're the same picture. It's just separated by a century. It's quite remarkable. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were more electric cars in New York City than gasoline-powered cars. Now, in 1896, there was a famous dinner with Thomas Edison and a young engineer from the Detroit Edison Company named Henry Ford, and Ford explained to Edison over dinner about this thing he was inventing, an automobile. And Edison said, "Young man, very good, run on hydrocarbons, great fuel." Edison changed his mind about 4 years later and said, "This is dirty, inefficient, let's have electric cars." Spent a lot of money on it. And it turned out that the electric car just couldn't compete once Ford came out with his Model T, $825 without the top, and the automobile it was gasoline powered. And then in the 1920s, as kind of the electric car faded away, it was known as one of two things. It was known as the ladies' car because it wasn't dirty. It was easy for ladies to drive. They didn't have to crank it. And it was also known as the doctor's car. And the doctors into the 1920s would make house calls in their electric car for some reason. It was very typical, faded away. But now it's back. But I think it's still very early days for the electric car. When I was in China maybe 2 years ago, much enthusiasm, now a sense that it's a longer road. So, and now there's a lot of talk about natural gas powered cars because of the abundance of natural gas. So, but I think we will end up with a more diversified automobile fleet in terms of fuel sources, and that will be a good thing. So let me just conclude with one final thought. I don't know, a lot of authors here today, and it's interesting to ask them what do they find to be the most difficult part of the book to write. I find the most difficult part of the book to write, not surprisingly, is the conclusion, because you've asked the reader, asked all of you to spend a lot of time going through the book with you, and you have to decide both for yourself and for your readers, what's the takeaway? What do you want people to really remember? How do you bring it all together? And so I struggled with it a long time, and I concluded, that I want this to be a book that people do really understand the risks, the challenges, the kind of dangers that are there, but at the same time, to also, this book I really regard as an optimistic book. Why? Well, I came across another character that helped me tell that story. Right towards the end, there was a young man named Sadi Carnot. Engineers will know the Carnot cycle. And in 1824, a long time ago, he wrote a paper called On the Motive Force of Power. He wanted to explain to people, particularly French people, how the steam engine worked. because he was not only a scientist and an engineer, he's also a soldier. His father had actually been Minister of War under Napoleon, and he was convinced that one reason Britain had defeated France in the Napoleonic Wars was because of its mastery of the steam engine, so he wanted to explain it to people. And even then, geopolitics and energy came together. So I found this quote in which he said, in this paper he wrote, he said, this harnessing of energy by humanity, which had never happened before really, he called a great revolution in human affairs. And I thought about it, and I thought really in a sense that if we go back from the 1770s to where we are today, this really has been a great revolution. There are constantly technologies that change things. We think we're at the end of the road, things are done, there's nowhere to go. Technology opens doors. And the reason that I have this optimism is that I don't think that this process of innovation and change, there's any reason it's going to stop. That we need this great revolution, and that it will continue, and it has to continue to meet the needs, the kind of urgent challenges that we face in the world, and to meet the needs of a growing world economy. So I think that's where I really conclude the book, and I'd love to have your comments and questions right now. So thank you very much. Do we have roving mics? Oh.
Right here.
Oh, they're the mics. Sorry, folks. Okay.
Hi, thanks a lot.
I thought you were leaving. I didn't realize you were going to the mic.
There are certainly places where hydropower is a possibility, and in some developing countries, there's a lot of interest in that. I would like you to say where you think this is going and where this could be relied upon for some significant input into energy use.
Well, it does vary. It's, if you look back, the New Deal, one of the great symbols of the New Deal in the United States was the building of all these dams. And in the Northwest and other parts of the country and Tennessee Valley, the dams are a very important source of power. I forgot what the share of our electricity that we get from hydropower is. I'm not sure I know the number, but some countries like Brazil, the majority of their electricity comes from hydropower. I think it's much harder today to build big dams because of environmental opposition. China built the Three Gorges Dam and has plans for other large dams, but there's more questioning of it because of, what's the impact on the region and perhaps the seismic impact of it. So, I think the days of the World Bank supporting large dams is probably past, but hydropower will be part of it, and then there are smaller dams. But I think in our country, if anything, the movement would be to sort of roll it back somewhat for environmental reasons.
You were talking about electric cars. There's actually a large display of electric cars and plug-in vehicles on 3rd Street right in front of the U.S. Capitol today. Today happens to be National Plug-in Day.
Oh, well.
I don't know if you were aware of that.
I'll wander over.
My question was, at what level of adoption of electrics and non-fossil fuel cars will it begin to have an effect on the oil companies? For example, if 5% of the U.S. fleet were electrified, would the oil companies start to become concerned about that? And what about 10% or 20%?
Well, I think, you have to look at it in terms of what share of the new fleet, because, we have, what do we have, about almost 300 million cars in the country. I think that's the number. Is that the number? But I think that, our fleet only rolls over a few percentages, every year. So even if we had a very aggressive case for electric vehicle adoption, you really wouldn't start to see the impact on the fleet until, well after 2020, maybe 2025 or something like that. However, I think if you started seeing, 5-10% of the new cars being sold being electric or plug-ins in some fashion, kind of that would change the psychology of the market and see it as a more diversified market. So I think from the, I think the oil companies are still preoccupied with the question of how do you meet the growing demand. And in China is still going to be an awful lot of new gasoline-powered cars. So I think it's kind of after the turn of the next decade that if it really starts to gain traction, we would see that impact.
Hi, I'm so thrilled that you are optimistic about our future because after seeing the documentary Gaslands, I was terribly depressed, and I just wanted to ask you about fracking and the pollution of our water sources,
Right.
and the coming water wars and how all that fits in.
Right. Well, I think that that's a very, it's a very powerful, movie. I know, as I said, I was on this committee that was appointed at the request of President Obama, and we reported to the Secretary of Energy, and we had heard testimony from the head of the oil and gas regulation in the state of Colorado, for instance, saying the scene of the faucet being lit had nothing to do with fracking. It was a result either of a poor construction of a gas well a couple of decades ago, or in one case, somebody drilling his water well through basically a deposit of natural gas. So there's a lot about a lot of debate about the factual basis of that movie. When we did our commission, and it clearly is a subject of great debate and concern, we had some very eminent scientists on it, and the conclusion was the notion that the relatively small amount of chemicals that are used in fracking getting into the water supply, as the scientists said, was very, very, very unlikely. That there were three environmental questions. One is the wastewater question. What do you do? Because you drill a well, wastewater comes out and it has bad things in it. How do you dispose of that water? And traditionally, people have, we've drilled many wells and they dispose of it by re-injecting it or treating it. And we sort of said that that's an issue that really needs focus about reducing the amount of water that's used or recycling the water or finding new ways to treat it, and a lot of efforts going into it. Second question is local air pollution resulting from the industrial activity, and that is something that, needs to be managed. And the third thing is community impact, just a lot of trucks showing up in a community and starting to do it, and that kind of not doing it in a hit and miss fashion, but with the involvement of the local stakeholders and the communities. So we had about 20 recommendations to address it. And I guess, again, I would say, I think reasonable optimism in terms of saying there are a series of things to do in terms of regulation, best practices, innovation, that will address the question. And that, we're already, as I say, it's about 40% of our natural gas production now. So I think it's been a healthy debate to have the debate, but I think there are reasonable answers to it. Thank you. Okay.
I have a question about coal. I have a lot of family members in West Virginia, and where coal is a big issue there. What do you see in the future for development of coal resources? Is there such a thing as clean coal? Is that ever going to happen?
Well, it's, clean coal has been discussed for a long time. It has different meanings. It was actually something that was much on the agenda when I was just in China too, because China is the largest coal. 80% of their electricity is generated with coal. There are different meanings of clean coal. One is much more efficient burning of coal in power plants, replacing old ones with new ones. Another one means capturing the coal in some ways, but I think at large scale, that's not. You'd have to create this whole new industry. People talk about big oil. You'd have to have another industry called big carbon to do it. And the third is to find actually something to do with the CO2 on a commercial basis. But what you see in our country, and this sort of goes back to the previous question, right now natural gas is so cheap, it's continuing to push coal out of electric generation. And our generation of coal has gone down from, I think, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, 52% coal, down to around 38% now, replaced by natural gas. So we're now exporting coal to China, which has this continuing growing need for it. So I think, if you sort of have an agenda, and one of the things I do believe is we need a high level of R&D, continuing R&D spending. One of it is to find ways to address, to give new meaning to that word, clean coal.
Thanks.
Dr. Yergin, it's a pleasure to have you here and listen. I read the prize in 2006, and one thing I always thought was interesting, talking a little bit about the writing process and how it unfortunately ended, just right before the Iraqi, or at the beginning of the first Iraqi war. And I was curious, was that nagging you over the past 2 decades in any way or form? How it just ended right there. And also, since The Quest is a little bit different book, do you think there's a chance you might have that type of thing happen over the next few years?
Certainly things will happen over the next few years. I mean, there will constantly new surprises, and they could be technology surprises. Maybe the cost of solar will continue to really go down. Geopolitical in terms of something actually happening with Iran. It's interesting you say that, because when I was finishing the prize, I'd run into somebody I'd known who had been a delegate to OPEC, and he'd been at an OPEC meeting, and he said he'd never seen such strong armed tactics by any country, i.e. Iraq. So I rewrote the end of for that and other reasons, the prize to focus on Saddam Hussein, and then of course, not knowing that the war would happen when it did. But to sort of get a handshake across the years, I kind of begin this book with the invasion of Iraq and George Bush saying, not so fast, as a way to continue it. But I think one thing about the energy business, it's a very long-term business. These investments are made. You take a coal plant, gentleman was asking about coal, they might last 60 or 70 years, but every 3 or 4 years it seems something significant happens that changes the way we look at things, and there's a whole new consensus or a new, last time we had a presidential election, we were going to run out of energy. We were short of energy. Now we have a glut of natural gas, and our oil production's going up, and you can see our political discourse is changing. I looked at President Obama's State of the Union addresses. The first two, he only mentioned oil and gas once. In the last State of the Union address, almost as much time was spent on oil and gas as was spent on renewable energy and clean technology. So, things will change, and they may be in the economic sphere, they may be in the political sphere, or they may be in the technology sphere, and they may come as surprises, but then we'll look back and see how inevitable it was. So, thank you.
In the prize, you so clearly point out that the world switched from energy sources first with wood, then to coal, and then of course Churchill to petroleum, because the customer always got a better product, better performance. In the case of electric cars, the customer arguably does not get a better product. It's long recharge times, short driving distances, etc. The vehicles of today still get approximately the same sort of performance parameters in that regard as the RAV4 from 20 years ago, the Ford Ranger electric vehicles, etc. Is it possible to imagine electric cars when the customer might not be getting a better product than today, considering that petroleum has so much higher of an energy density than electric batteries?
Well, that's a very good question, and in a way, as you say, each wave is you've gotten a more efficient source, you've gotten more power from it. That's why I think it's still very early days in the electric car, and that the big gating item is the battery, to get a battery that kind of delivers performance, that charging is not a long production and so forth. And so that kind of excitement of 2 years ago is now more tempered. And we've seen, interestingly, some of the very ballyhooed battery companies that were, seen as the wave of the future. And I'm thinking of A123 battery, which is now, the stock got as high as $25, it got down to 50 cents, and it's just been bought by the Chinese, which indicates that it's it's just going to be more challenging. And that's why, in answer to that previous question, I don't think we can expect high penetration of electric vehicles anytime soon, because you do need to meet the same performance standards. Obviously, a lot of argument when I talk to different CEOs of the automobile industry about electric cars. I found a very wide range of views. Some, and one who's in the book, who's very enthusiastic about it, and others saying, well, yes, we're doing it, we think it's interesting, but the cost really got to come down to kind of meet the kind of challenge that you're talking about. Thank you.
What about the possibility that has been mentioned many times of a solar panel on every roof of every home in the country? I believe Germany gets 20% of their power from solar, and they don't have anywhere near the sun we have. With the smart electric meters where you could sell your excess back to the company at the cost it cost the company to create the electricity, and have a place to plug your car in. For example, where I live in Melbourne, Florida, I rarely drive more than 25 miles from my home. So a 150-mile range car would be perfect for
Do you have an electric car yet, or?
No, I don't. If I had, haven't seen one that gets me that I can get charged quickly enough.
Right.
But what about that power, or the possibility of the so-called black energy that's being looked at?
Well, in the book, I quote a man named Ziegler, who's the one who actually fought to get the solar panels up, the solar cells up in that first Vanguard satellite, and his vision was every rooftop of America. I think it's a question of cost and efficiency. A lot of progress has been made in solar, but they have to become much more still efficient to get to really large scale. It's just interesting how small it is, and I think, I'm on the Energy Initiative Advisory Board at MIT, and I asked what are more professors are working on solar than anything else. So I don't think we're there yet to get to kind of that kind of scale. But I think what you have is a vision that some people have of a whole renewable network. Now the other thing is, now even in Melbourne, Florida, the sun doesn't shine all the time, and so storage is a big challenge. Is one of those other steps that kind of frontiers in energy. So I think, I think that the solar still does depend upon continuing, incentives, subsidies, whatever you want to call them. And Germany is willing to pay 5 times the cost to have solar as opposed to other electricity, because it's kind of their value system. But actually, even on solar, I think wind is still a much larger share of their electricity mix than solar. And that's why sometimes I think one has to look at them together. But ultimately, is the future, probably in some form, it is a solar future. It's kind of when.
When you talk about optimism about the future, what is your time horizon for that? I can understand a few decades or something like that, but do you think about a couple hundred years out or beyond that, whether you're optimistic?
No, my frontier doesn't go that far. I think what I was struck by is I kind of had to say, even what would things look like in 2030? And at this point, the view I would have, and it's in the book, is we'll see this big growth. Going back to the previous question, we'll see a lot of growth in solar and renewables, but we're also going to see a lot of growth in conventional energy, so that our energy mix wouldn't look too different in 2030 from it looks then. But by 2030, all this work and labs and research that's been going on now, we would start to see a more global impact. In the 90s, for the Clinton administration, I ran a task force in energy R&D. One of the things I found really disturbing is to see this spending that goes up and down, very unstable. And if that's why a level field and then we would start to see the impacts, but it will take that's when I would think we'd start to see, because things take a long time to get in the mix. Even shale gas, it seems to burst on the scene, but it was 25 years in development before people began to notice it. So thank you. I think I'm given the message of overtime, so I apologize to everybody who's patiently stood there, and maybe we'll be able to continue the dialogue later on, but thank you very much for joining me this today. Thank you. And as an author, I should just say the title of the book is The Quest. So thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.